Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Tim McGuinness. I'm a director of the Society of Citizens Against Relationship Scams, Inc. We are a nonprofit, government-registered, government-partnered crime victims assistance and crime prevention organization. Our mission is to help victims avoid, discover, and recover from online financial fraud, in other words, scams. Today, we're doing another of our webinars to educate and inform about financial fraud and scams, scammers, and also to help scam victims to fully understand the nature of these crimes, how it affects them, and ways for them to be able to recover from these crimes. Joining me today are our guest hosts, Debby Montgomery Johnson, who is an entrepreneur, advocate, author, and outspoken supporter of online crime victims, and is one herself, fully recovered, also a director of SCARS as well. Good morning, Debby.
Good morning, Dr. Tim.
Also joining us for the first time on our webinar series is Vianey Gonzalez from our SCARS Latino America office in Monterrey, Nuevo León, Mexico. Vianey is a certified expert in deception, is a certified life coach, and is also a psychologist in the making. She herself has been a victim of online financial fraud, in other words, romance scams to be specific. Good morning, Vianey. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks.
Okay, so today we're going to be touching on a very interesting topic. We're going to be talking about victim blaming and victim hate. This is an extraordinarily difficult subject that most victims find themselves being the focus of at one point or another. Now, it's important for us to put out our disclaimer. The views of the speakers or presenters are not necessarily the views of the Society of Citizens Against Relationship Scams, Inc., an incorporated nonprofit organization. SCARS is not responsible for the accuracy of any information provided during this presentation. The speakers are solely responsible for their comments and content. So let's dive into victim blaming and hate, because it's a topic that affects most victims of scams in one way or another. In today's webinar, we're going to be talking about victims of romance and other relationship scams. But we're specifically going to focus on victim blaming, victim abuse and alienation and isolation, and the lasting trauma. So let's start with why victims are blamed. This is a difficult topic, so feel free, either of you, to jump in here at any particular point. But essentially, there's several kinds of victim blaming that takes place. There is victim blaming that still takes place in law enforcement and the criminal justice system. There is still victim blaming that takes place in families and friends. There is victim blaming that actually takes place by the criminals themselves. Now, this is a little bit more like abuse, but it is a kind of blaming that is intended to be manipulative, particularly towards the end of scams where the victim is becoming more resistant. And I think that's worthy of talking about also, because it's not often discussed. Then there is why victims blame each other. In other words, victims blaming other victims. And lastly, victims blaming themselves. So that's a lot to talk about. And I think that we should stay focused on these topics today rather than try and jump into a lot of mechanics and other aspects of scam, because these are the universal topic that every victim experiences regardless of the type of scam. So maybe to begin, Debbie, let's talk a little bit about the law enforcement side of victim blaming. We've all heard it. You've experienced it, both of you yourself, in reporting these crimes to law enforcement. Maybe not as severe as other victims have. And I think a great deal of it has to do with the victim's expectations when they go in and talk to law enforcement. Because if their expectations are wildly out of sync with reality, then nearly everything the law enforcement says, the police say, is going to sound like blaming. What are your thoughts, Debbie?
Well, I think in the past, I mean, when I discovered my scam back in 2012, I didn't go to the local police right away. I went right to the FBI because I figured they're the ones that could take care of it because it was international in scope. I didn't feel the victim blame. However, I did not get the assistance that I thought I might have received from them. They told me that there was nothing that they could do if the perpetrator was not in the United States. And at that point, I did shut down because I figured if the FBI can't help me, nobody can. When I've taken victims into local police departments, I think we felt initially, I felt for the victim because she was scared that the police didn't understand. And the person that I was talking to was probably not the right person to have talked to just to get a report on the books. And it was tough because the other victim felt like she was shamed by that police officer because I just don't think that he understood what we were looking for and how to handle it. If we had had maybe a victim advocate, that might have worked out a little bit better.
A question. Do you think the police officer was deliberately shaming that person?
Not at the time. I have had people feel deliberately shamed though, whereas we walked in and I think over time and as we put more out to law enforcement, they understand it a little bit better. But typically, yeah, they don't get it. It's something that you feel like you're really stupid bringing it up, and I believe that's why a lot of victims don't want to report it because they don't know how to articulate it well enough. And we've changed the wording, and that's what I really like is that we've changed the wording from scam to fraud. Fraud makes it easier and more understandable, I think, for law enforcement than a romance scam.
Right. Recently, we did an interview with a prosecutor from the state of California who raised some interesting points about very subtle but insidious victim blaming, particularly one where she was mentioning comments made by a judge.
And that's just, yeah, for me, that's extraordinarily annoying because the judges are supposed to be impartial and really listen to the facts. But I saw that too, and when I went out to Dallas for the sentencing of a criminal. Over the course of the sentencing hearing, as the prosecutors and the judge and everybody listened to what was going on, the case from the FBI, which was extraordinary, I thought. But when our victim made an impact statement, I believe that plus the statements that were sent in made a huge difference in the way the judge looked at the sentencing. Because it was a crime against the elderly in Texas. It was a federal crime. And when he could put a face to a story, it made a huge difference. It went from a 5-year sentence to a 14-year sentence.
Right. And
I believe that the next time the judge gets one of these, he will look at it based on what he saw in that first trial. So but when we heard from the prosecutor and she said this cryptocurrency, when the victim could be an average person who might be looking to get extra money, the comment she made is that the judge just flatly thought that the victim was some really wealthy person sitting on a yacht somewhere, and it didn't matter to them if they lost $10,000, $100,000, whatever. And that was disturbing because the judge automatically categorized the victim as someone with a lot of money, and it didn't matter if they lost a little bit more.
Right.
And that's not the cases we're seeing in these pig butchering scams.
Well, it's, the same could be said for victims who lost 100,000, 500,000, a million also. So the perception by anyone on the outside that they lost $1 million, well, they could afford it.
Well, and I got that. When I came out and said that I'd lost $1 million, I always continue on that story saying I didn't have it. I found it. I sold stuff. I didn't have $1 million in the bank, and I've gotten victim shamed on that one. Boy, I wish I had $1 million I could give away. I didn't have it in my bank account.
Well, so I think, and I can speak from personal experience because, as you know, I've been educating the world about scams for, 31 years. And truth be told, for a big portion of that, I could never understand how people could be, quote unquote, duped and fall into these traps and send that money. So my revelation happened about 2013, 2014, and it was a light bulb moment. But it still took me at least another year or so to fully get my head around the reality of how incredibly complex and sophisticated and functional scammers are able to groom and manipulate and control, even though the scammers themselves do not understand any of these issues, but they're following scripts that were well engineered by people who do understand these issues to be able to perform the kind of control that's necessary to manipulate victims into doing what they want. And the truth is, as we've seen in the case of money mules, for example, if scammers actually wanted victims to go and rob banks, victims probably would. They probably wouldn't kill their children. There are some lines that people won't cross as easily. But, the range of ways in which scammers could control a victim is actually pretty significant. Good example of this is I've heard cases in the past where scammers so manipulated a married victim that the victim divorced their spouse. And yet it was all 100% manipulation. In some cases, the victim realized it in time. In other cases, they have not. But it's difficult for the public to understand this if they've never personally experienced it. And
Oh, absolutely. You're talking about robbing a bank. I mean, I asked my parents for money. I have never done that. I used to
kind of like robbing a bank.
I categorize myself as that damn Yankee who doesn't give money away. I was very careful about my finances. I always wanted to be out of debt. And, as a former banker, even, I've seen family members being taken, typically by other family members. But I'm thinking, looking back, I would never have done that.
Right.
Outside of this situation. And, but you can never say never, because it obviously happens. And I mean, the victims the survivors that we talk to all the time are just like me. And we are just good-hearted people that were manipulated. And I hated that word when the FBI told me that, when they said that to me, because I'm like, no, I was in control the whole time. Well, as I've learned over time, that was not the case. And that's what's valuable about SCARS and what we're learning here.
Right. And that, just as an aside, That is one of the most challenging things about supporting victims is their level of resistance, rejection, and denial. Now, denial is a really hard word to throw around, but certainly a significant number of victims are resistant to these ideas. You know, one of the ironic challenges that we as an organization had in our early days, actually before you joined us, Debbie, but was unrelenting hate towards us as an organization in certain sectors by other anti-scam experts. No, there's nothing wrong with victims. Victims aren't manipulated. Victims were duped. Victims were fooled. Victims were brainwashed. And these were people who'd been involved in helping other victims of scams for a long, long time. Baloney. But the level of hate, I mean, we used to get bomb threats at our offices when our offices were actually fully accessible to the public. There was a period of time, particularly in late 2015, where we used to get a bomb threat every month. And we'd get even death threats against members of our team. I was not so personally visible at that point in time, so I didn't get them. But we had employees that were part of our organization that would get incredible, hateful threats from other so-called compassionate anti-scam groups.
See, I don't understand that. I mean, we're out to be a support to someone. We're not challenging. I mean, if someone doesn't want to hear what
we are challenging.
We're challenging them, but we're not challenging the victim. Well, we are, but not, I mean, we're only challenging them to accept what happened. Right. And if they don't want to accept that, we can't support, you know?
Can't help them.
We can't help them. And we want to, but I've had victims come to me and say, you don't get it. You don't understand. And I'm thinking, okay, I've got 5, 10
What don't we understand?
They don't want to hear what I had to say. And that's fine. That's a choice. But to actually come out in hatred and just the term duped, you know, or whatever else you said, those are not the
appropriate terms at all.
Those are very negative words. Those are hate words against us to begin with. And so I guess I'm just kind of, maybe that Pollyanna in me wants, you know, let's be kind. This is a traumatic situation for everybody involved, and there's no room for that nasty vitriol against anybody. And I don't know. You and I were talking yesterday that this would shut most victims down. For me, it's thrown me into that fight mode, and I don't want to fight because I value my time and I want to be supportive of people. Most victims would go into what we call that freeze mode. You know, they would hide, they would be scared, they wouldn't want to have anybody challenge them in that negative manner, and which is another reason why we don't really want our victims to be speaking out for a while until they understand what's happened. But it's just,
but also so that they aren't confronted by negativity or even scammers, because scammers, you know, we'll get to that in a minute. So I think, you know, the issue with law enforcement blaming is purely based upon ignorance. And as an organization, the reason we have interviews, the reason we do outreach, the reason we do advocacy is to be able to expand on that message that victims are blameless, they're groomed, manipulated, and controlled. End of story. They're not brainwashed, they're not duped, they're not naive. If somebody uses those words, look them up, because they don't mean what you think they mean. Brainwashing requires control of the victim physically, change their entire belief system. Scam victims haven't had their belief system changed. They're simply being manipulated. They're under control for a short period of time, and then they return to control. With trauma, to be sure, but they're not brainwashed. It's the wrong word. God, people argue with me all the time about that. But I wave the definition of these words in people's faces, and then they see the light. So this whole process of victim blaming is really a series of light bulb moments, both for victims and for those that blame them. So,
Excuse me, I think at the beginning, the first days after we saw that all was a scam, it's difficult to understand what happened. And in that time, we blame ourselves. And that is the way that we show to others. We maybe talk with friends or someone and we show them blaming ourselves. And that was the first impression that others have to us. That's why sometimes the friends or the family also blame.
yes.
Because we show first as blame ourselves.
Right. So in effect, victims sell their blame to other people in the way they communicate, in their own beliefs about their own blame. And this has a great deal to do with police blaming of victims.
Because also when some victims go to the police, they go in showing blaming themselves. That's why the police also think it's your fault because you are blaming. It's very important how we show to the others.
Well, I interviewed a gal
that will be the first impression.
I interviewed a gal the other day, and she said, and that's exactly it. She goes, the outside is mirroring the inside.
Right.
So if we feel that, that's coming across, and then that's what law enforcement sees and feels from us, and it's contagious.
Right.
Blame is contagious, and that's
Exactly.
unfortunate.
And that was the first impression the others have for us. Because we are blaming, that's what we show to others, and the others is what we see for us. But I know that was the first days, first weeks, because we are very confused about what happened or what we are going to happen with the scam or all that things that we understand about that. But
You know, it's if somebody's in a physical accident and they're physically traumatized, their first contact is going to be with emergency medical technicians who are going to be professional, compassionate. They're there to save their lives. And then they're going to be taken to an emergency room where they're dealing with more professionals who understand this completely. And as soon as the person is stabilized, next comes potentially psychological counseling. Hospitals often have psychologists on staff, psychiatrists on staff. So a person is getting a very appropriate professional guidance from the very beginning. But scam victims, there is no emergency room where they can go. So they run around, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but I mean literally run around trying to find answers. And they go into the police with the wrong set of expectations. And we've talked about this in our webinar on how to talk to the police, how to tell your story to the police. We also have a victims checklist for how to interact with the police. Victims tend to focus on the thing that occupied the most amount of their time during the crime, which was the constant chats, dialogue between the victim and the scammer, which is completely irrelevant. It's a bit like you're in a traffic accident and you're trying to tell the EMT about where you've been for the last 4 hours. It's not relevant to saving your life. So I think part of it stems from law enforcement frustration that scam victims can make it difficult to get the information or give the information that the law enforcement, the police need to be able to work through the report in a way that will be helpful for law enforcement and helpful for the victim. So think to a great extent, unless a police officer is overtly abusive, in other words, they're deliberately blaming a victim, we have to chalk this up to ignorance, perhaps a little bit of frustration in dealing with a victim who doesn't know what to say, what to do, how to present information, even how to be organized, is still substantially in shock. We would think that law enforcement already knows how to deal with this because they deal with it in sexual assault, they deal with it in violent crimes, they deal with it with victims of domestic abuse. But I think one of the things that we haven't talked about is that really we sort of segue into society. Debbie, you and I talked to someone from a TV production company yesterday. Not to blame him, but there is so much ignorance about these crimes that they treat them as something different. They're not looking at them as a crime. Oh, it's just catfishing. Oh, it's just a love scam. It's this constant minimization that is so corrosive and, in fact, overtly blaming in the process.
I think, though, if you've not been involved in it like we are, that it's very easy to look at it like, well, gosh, how could someone have that happen to them? And they're looking at it, television for the most part is looking at it from a ratings point of view, or what kind of a show can we draw in the audience? And the audience that they're maybe drawing in, if they're doing a show like that, such as Catfish or whatever, is that they're looking, again, they're looking to blame the victims. They are not looking to educate. And I think that's our point of view now, is we're trying to educate the public because this is happening on such a huge scale around the globe, that if people would understand it, if they would hear about it in an organized fashion, in a way that they can understand, that doesn't put any blame on anybody except for the criminal, then it's not about the ratings. It's about how can we support people. And like you told him yesterday, you know, victim of a romance scam is treated so much differently than a victim of domestic violence. You can't see our wounds except in the bank account. You know, I'm not having a walking in with a black eye. But years ago, even when a woman walked into the police department with a black eye, they told her to go home and be nice. You know, so it's evolving over time. And I think as more people, unfortunately, are getting taken by criminals, the louder the conversation is getting, and the more active people are in trying to find out how this is really happening. But you got to get past the anger point. You have to get past the blaming yourself, and you have to get past blaming anybody else. It's understanding how it happens, why it happens, and how we can stop it at all levels. And we need to see it seriously taken seriously by social media, by the media, by the government. You know, until they understand how much money is being taken and shipped overseas, it's going to affect everybody in the long run. But unfortunately, you know, ratings do sell, and they have to have something that's going to attract people. But I'm really very proud of what we're doing as an organization to educate the people that are really looking to find out what's going on. And little by little, we will have an impact. But it starts with the individual not blaming themselves, as Vianey said, because that's where, unfortunately, that's where it does start. And we all go through that. And we have to learn why before we can step out of that position ourselves. So.
And it also comes from really comprehending the trauma that victims experience.
Absolutely.
I know, Debbie, you have, and I think Vianey did as well. We are all certified in trauma-informed care. And we've applied that with vigor in our own organization in everything that we do, in our communications, both in terms of educational materials, our writings, and in our direct interaction with the victims through our recovery program. You know, we're not psychologists, we're not psychiatrists, We're not mental health care workers, though we do have people in those roles in our organization. But we are a victims assistance organization that employs trauma-informed care in everything that we do. So let's talk about society now, how society blames. We've already touched on this quite a bit. And why do non-victims feel so threatened by victims? You know, we saw the same thing in sexual assault a couple of generations back, right? Oh, she was wearing the wrong kind of clothes and in the wrong part of town and associating with the wrong kinds of people. But we know that that's all nonsense. People who are assaulted because they had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time in front of the wrong person. Now, when I say that, that doesn't mean that they had control of those elements at all, because we know that people are sexually assaulted in their workplace, in their homes, anywhere, shopping malls, parking lots. It happens where it happens because that's where the criminal is. No other reason. And the same is true of scams, online financial fraud, that the victims simply had the misfortune of being accessible to a criminal. But one of the things that exists in the world are a variety of psychological drivers, for lack of a better term, that affect non-victims. Their own biases. They see the world the way they want to see the world. They blame other people, sometimes because they themselves feel some form of guilt themselves. Many times people carry past traumas, and this influences the way they see other victims. There is a psychological, I guess distortion is probably the best word for it, called Schadenfreude. Difficult to pronounce, but effectively it's a way of blaming others by seeing the faults in others to avoid seeing the faults in yourself. The Australians call it tall poppy syndrome, where anybody that stands out automatically becomes subject to the mob's abuse because they do stand out and victims stand out. But I think a lot of it has to do with denial, that non-victims blame victims because they're afraid to admit that they themselves could become a victim. What do you think?
I totally agree. And it goes back to the outside is mirroring the inside. We
Right.
cannot see ourselves unless it's a reflection of what's, in someone else, that they've got the same thing as we have. But it's interesting on this past year around Valentine's Day when we had the Tinder swindler and Inventing Anna come out. And we had that discussion about how the victims of those two shows were portrayed. And in one, the three girls in Tinder Swindler were excoriated by everybody as gold diggers, and all they were women with big hearts. The criminal
Right.
looked at, he got off. In Inventing Anna, she was looked at like the little Robin Hood character,
Right.
Robin from the rich. And those rich guys, or the bankers and everybody else, they were victims also. And so it was interesting how we I think see the victim in the light of what is out there in the media. And until, like in our case, until a person hears our story in person, or the judge heard our victim story in person, until you can really relate personally with a victim, you don't get it. I don't know.
I think also it's because I blame you because I don't know how to help you. because I don't understand what are you living, and I don't know how to face you. It's like parents when the child where they are in dangers. Sometimes we don't know how to face that, and we blame the children. It's the same case here. Sometimes the victims are blaming because the person around us don't know how to help us or don't understand what are we living through. Sometimes.
You know, it's interesting.
Anything at all.
We collaborated in the creation of a National Geographic episode in their Trafficked series on romance scams. And we put out extraordinary effort to help educate the production crew, the principals, on the reality of this topic, what victims experience and what's necessary, and the criminals and their mindset, etc. And then what did they do? They really didn't take the victims' statements in context. They just kind of threw them out there without really any deeper explanation one way or another. And then proceeded to go and visit the scammers and apologize for the scammers. Oh, they live in a poor country and they're poor, blah, blah, blah. But they're not. And criminals do this for the exact same justifications that all criminals do it. And we're fortunate to have an advisor to our organization who is an ex-cyber criminal, Brett Johnson. And he's the first one to admit that it's all BS, that all criminals have similar, well, except for, you know, the hardcore sociopaths, psychopaths. But most criminals have this hierarchy of justifications for their actions. A lot of it has to do with opportunity. A lot of it has to do with simple, plain greed on their part. They want the money. The thing that I found so offensive in that series was the crocodile tears of the scammers in Ghana talking about how harmful this is on the victims and how they feel sorry for them. But they don't stop. You know, one of them even talked about how victims commit suicide. But they don't really care. They keep going. And to portray that and not put it in any context, I thought was quite offensive for victims. But, and my overall take on the episode was it identified kind of this Robin Hood-esque kind of situation with those Ghana scammers, and actually kind of did not explain realistically how the manipulation works or put the victim statements in context. Because when you saw these guys sitting in a hut with palm fronds on the roof, and there's 4 of them sitting there with their cell phones near the beach or wherever the hell it was, it is impossible to believe that these are as sophisticated a criminal as they are. But, you know, we know in Nigeria just a couple of weeks ago, or about 10 days ago, 140 individual criminals were arrested who were part of one gang. These are large organizations. And when we talk about the pig butchering scams out of China, these are even bigger organizations. In the country of Bhutan, last year, they arrested 55,000 Chinese national scammers in 1 year in that little tiny country. I think you're right. The media must change their approach.
Well, it sells better to have a guy sitting in a hut with a cell phone than having 100 guys in shirts and ties getting arrested in a Nigerian business office.
And you know, we told them where to go. Go to the university in Kumasi, go to the universities in Accra, and you will see them there. They didn't even lift a finger.
Well, it's time, Tim, and I think the value of what we did is that we got our side out as best we could, you know, we're making people aware a little bit at a time, and over time, the more the word gets out, the more people that get taken, the more are going to be interested in what happens. And it's unfortunate that so many have to be taken for something to change. But that's what's going to be the impetus for this change. It's a speaking up, it's a standing up, it's a victim's understanding for themselves what happened, not blaming themselves, educating their families, their friends, anybody. I mean, I met a woman, I overheard a conversation in the airport the other day flying home from my kids, and this woman was sitting beside her mother talking to her about, I know it's a scam, I know it, and the mother's going, well, don't send money, don't send money. And I had to stand up and give this woman my card, and I went over and I was like, you are being taken, please listen to me. This is the organization I work with, this is what happened to me. We have to be alert to the conversations that are being said, because usually it's muffled, you know, people aren't talking out loud. But we need, those of us that have been through it have got to stand up for what we know. And we have to stand up and help these people, because they don't know where to go. This woman was going to continue doing it because she wasn't quite sure how to get out of it. And her mother sitting there just, oh, I could see the mother just going, oh, stop, stop, stop. And I'm like, you have to hear my point of view on this one, because it happened to me and this is how. And she was so grateful that I said something, because I normally stick to myself in an airport. I don't want to put myself out there. But in this case, I had the obligation to speak up, because she was a victim and she was not going to know how to get out of that unless she heard my story. So it's incumbent upon us, and I'm talking about all survivors, and I know it's difficult to speak up, but each one of us needs to know we're not alone in this. And it could be someone else that we know that's going to be the next victim. And how horrible we would feel if it was our mother or father or child or something that got taken because we didn't speak up about it.
Right. You know, Vianey, you do this. Debbie, you do this. I do this. My scam was actually an Al-Qaeda cell in 2001. But the issue with all victims is being a victim does not make you an expert in the subject matter. But it does mean that you understand that scams happen. And you can communicate with someone who's in the middle of a scam and help them get out of it. The important part is don't believe you know more than you do. If you've been through training, and we're proud to say that this next week we turn on our mentoring program, which will allow free training to anyone that's actually interested in becoming a real victim's mentor, to help them through this process, to help them into recovery, help them get out of scams. But I think every victim has the ability to see other victims around them, because they are seeing them. They just aren't being aware. They're not being observant. You know, you take the organization MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. It's taken them nearly 30 years to minimize the impact that drunk driving has had. Unfortunately, they lost a lot of ground in the pandemic, as did we, because of the incredible explosion in scams. But it's all about putting yourself out there, as you say, speaking up, speaking out, standing up when you see someone, but also spreading the word that this exists, this is real. And it affects more people than violent crimes in the United States. In the United Kingdom, these kinds of frauds are 50% of all crimes that occur in the United Kingdom. Vianey, I know that you do a great job in helping on the Spanish language side of victims assistance. Multiple social media pages, support groups, our Spanish language education website, contraestafas.org. But Spanish language victims have a different perspective than we see on the English side. Can you talk just a little bit about that, where they minimize it in themselves. They tend to be more blaming of other victims. They tend to be more in denial. They don't want to talk about it. They just want to confirm that it was a scam and walk out and walk right back into the next scam. This is one of the things that makes it so hard.
Yes, the difference between Latin American victim is most of them don't blame other victims. They support, but in this case, they prefer don't talk about. Because it's very hard for the victim in Latin America when the other people in the neighbor parents know about this, because they blame that person worse
Right.
than the other victims. That's why they prefer don't talk about that scam. But the truth is they don't blame another victims.
Okay.
Why do you think they're blaming them, Vianey? Why would a neighbor blame you for being scammed?
Because sadly
Part of
in
the
Latin,
culture.
yes,
Well,
Latin
that's what I want to
American
get out.
cultures, yes, all your neighbor is like your family,
Or
and
They
everybody
do.
know about your life. If what time you go out of your house, what time you in. That's why it's better nobody know about your scam, because if one person know, everybody will know in your neighbor.
So how do they keep it silent anyway? I mean, obviously we isolate, so wouldn't the family and the friends have been concerned that they weren't out and about anyway?
Also, sometimes here in Latin America, if you are a scam victim, it's like if you were divorced. It's the same thing. Nobody know why you were divorced. You
Yeah.
And
keep
everybody
all that
assumes the
information.
worst.
Yes. Better you keep that information for you and your family. Just nobody want to know about that.
So let's talk about family and friends blame. A fun topic. So, one of the great challenges that victims have, new victims especially, is they're afraid to tell anyone for fear of being judged. And of course they will be judged. Everybody is judged everywhere all the time. It's more to do with whether or not you care about other people's judgment. But there's that aspect of it. And then one of the hardest is victims who are married who had no intention of developing a relationship, but because of the grooming, the amygdala hijacks the love bombs, the manipulation, and then the control, they're sucked into it against their will. And non-victims cannot understand this. It seems completely counterintuitive. How could you be sucked in to an internet infidelity against your will? But yet, interesting point, the truth is, most infidelity happens that way. It wasn't intentional.
Yeah.
Sort of develops a momentum of its own where it's beyond the person's control. Now, ironically, the same functions in the brain tend to be the causes of this. The amygdala, the cerebellum, etc., the lizard part of our brain that's back there squirming around. But, we've been pretty good about introducing the concepts of what really makes scams work to families and friends through our articles. We published a book on the topic to help them understand, our webinars, Dear Family and Friends, and also our webinar on how victims can talk to their families and friends and explain this. Debbie, you especially went through this because you had to explain this to your parents and to your children. Some were blaming, some were not.
Well, I found that, they were pretty upset. My mom and dad, not so much, although it affected them financially, but I took responsibility for them right off the bat. The kids originally, they wanted to make sure that I wasn't going to have to come live with them. And when I assured them that was not going to happen, they were okay. with time, it was interesting because I kept it quiet until I didn't. And when I didn't, I got great support from people because they realized the value of me at that point speaking up to help others. And then it became a support role, and they were very encouraging. Again, there was only that one person that I call gives me that stink eye at that one talk I gave, until I realized that I wasn't talking to her, that I needed to put my focus on the woman beside her that was bobbing her head up and down thinking, that's the lady I need to talk to. So the victim blame for me wasn't from speaking up until it went real public, and the anonymity of the speakers or the like the people online, where they had no accountability because I wasn't seeing them in person. They could victim blame me anonymously online.
Yeah, I have on the screen, for example, some of the kind of troll, hater blaming that goes on all the time against victims. You know, some people are incredibly cruel. This is one that you got, Debbie.
This is one that was on actually the report that we got the other day about the police over in the UK.
Oh yeah, yeah.
He shut down a troll because he put something out like this out.
Yep. I think in all.
Yeah, this was the one to me.
Yeah.
And it was not signed, you know, capital letters to
Right.
my personal email. And so, yeah, I could have years ago shut down by something like this, but it put me into that. Why does someone spend their time doing that? To me, it's a waste of valuable time. You brought up something really interesting. I was thinking about this there's an article that was written that I wrote for Aura magazine, and they keep posting it on my personal Facebook page or on my Woman Behind the Smile page. And I get these nasty icon, you know, the little emojis, like they're laughing or whatever. And I'm thinking that could possibly be a scammer, you know, putting that emoji out there. It could be a person who has no clue as to what's going on. I don't waste my time in responding to them. I typically block them, and then I delete that post. So there's things that we can do to, you know, because again, it gets my blood going, not in a freeze mode, because I'm past that. It's the people that are doing that are lacking the education as to what happened here. They're just, you know, popping off. It's like someone driving down the street and throwing you the bird. I would never do that, you know, but I can't catch anybody doing that. I can't really catch these people. I can't report them. It doesn't matter. It doesn't affect me unless I let it affect me.
But you see, that's the problem. That's the problem with victim blaming in general, is it is a form of bullying.
It is.
As we know,
It is.
everybody is potentially susceptible to some form of bullying. And the people who post things like that, they're freaking idiots. It's easy to say that, but what they really are is they're bullies. And ironically, that's a crime. It's called cyberbullying. And it's punishable by a fine of $13,000 and up to 5 years in a federal penitentiary in the United States. So yeah, we can punish them, but it's not worth the time and effort.
It's not. And to report them, you know, we don't get any justice from reporting them for the most part. I told you the other day I reported, I knew it was a fake profile. It took months to get that, you know, acknowledged that it was fake. So I don't waste my time with that.
But one of the things that I think is really important about this concept of trolling and bullying of victims, blaming them, both in person and anonymously, is victims are in a world of pain, incredible pain, as both of you experienced. And in that period of time after the scam, until you can begin to really learn why this happened, find the answers, find recovery, victims are very vulnerable. Mm-hmm. And it's tragic. Up to 20 victims take their life a day. And potentially many more that we just have no visibility of, because suicides are never reported in the news to speak about. So we can only go by what we can see and what we can reasonably extrapolate, project. So the thing about victim blame is it's not harmless. And the public, law enforcement, families and friends need to understand this, that you may not be giving a victim a fair shake. In other words, their opportunity to be listened to in compassion and empathy. And as a result of it, they could very well go back and take their own life. And we talk to typically a victim a day who's in that mindset. And we try to ease them off the ledge, direct them towards resources that will help them, whether it's Suicide Lifeline or one of the other hotlines around the world, or simply begin to explain what really happened. Because knowledge changes the equation in their mind from being totally emotionally driven to being able to comprehend really what happened to them and the fact that they can make it through this. You know, we've all talked to people who were in that situation, who were, you know, right on the edge.
I think if people would just understand that nobody gets through life without making a misstep or a mistake. We all have done something that we regret. And to have it thrown back at us all the time is never going to help us to move out of it and move forward. So just the empathy is lacking out there. And I think that's where we need to start really understanding who we are in relations to everybody else. You know, and I'm not going to get the spiritual side of me, but I really believe that we're here to support each other as best we can, to understand each other through our stories and our experiences, and leave the blame out of this whole thing. It's just not effective for anybody's recovery or anybody's life. And, you know, I try to put the negative people, they're out of my life as best I can get them now. And I maybe I'm at an age where it's not that I don't care, because I do care about how people feel about me, but it's not going to stop me from really moving forward, because I know that there's one person out there that needs to hear our story. And if 999 others don't need to, I'm going after that one. And a good friend of mine wrote a book called The One Philosophy, and it's all about we've got to be the one for someone else. It's not about us anymore. It's about that one that needs to hear us. And I don't need to hear the victim blame ever again.
Well,
it's very sad how the people blame the victim and don't tell anything about the criminals. Why?
The interesting part is, so all of these people are blaming the victim, but are they doing anything to make the situation better? Are they contacting their elected officials and demand change? No.
No.
Are they encouraging victims to report? No. They're simply blaming. Totally destructive, not productive.
And nothing about the criminal. They don't say nothing about the criminal. All about the victim and blame the victims.
Right.
But
It's
the
almost
truth
as
is
though-
that we are survivor, proud survivor about this, and we have the power to change this. Talking about scams and learn and inform about this. But this is a question: why they blame the victim and don't they say nothing about the criminals?
It's easier to blame us.
Great question. I think it's because, in large part, the victim is in front of them by whatever, either on the screen or physically in front of them. So all of their attention is focused on the victim. The criminal is just an idea out there somewhere.
Until you see him across the table in court. And then it's a real person. The criminal puts a face to what he did. And, you know, the one in Dallas, he turned around and told our survivor that he was sorry. Now, I'm not sure if he's sorry that he got caught or sorry because of what he did. But for a moment, it made her feel that she had been heard and that he understood that he hurt someone who could have been his grandmother.
Right.
Now, they're pretty family oriented, I think, that they wouldn't want to hurt their grandma, but they're not looking at us as their grandmothers or their sisters or their whatever. We're an easy mark. We're money. It's all about greed. It's all about money. And that's a whole nother show about why that criminal's not being blamed, because it's not the victim's fault ever.
Regardless of their age, whether they're a millennial or whether they're in middle age or whether they're a senior.
Exactly.
You know, in the time that remains, I think it's important for us to talk about the person who blames victims the most, themselves. So why don't you jump into that one, Debbie?
I think it comes from not understanding what actually happened. It's so easy to say, oh my gosh, I was so stupid, I shouldn't have done that. Those shoulda, coulda, wouldas, that comes, everything we do could have a shoulda, coulda, woulda. You know, every decision we make, it's a choice, either good or bad. And
right.
we work with a lot of men and women that are very well educated and very well financed. And, you know, to the world should never have been taken. Me, Vianey, you know, we should not have been taken. Tim, you, but we all are at a point, at some point in our lives, where we might be vulnerable to that. And it's just one of those things that happens. And we got to understand that regardless of how bright you are, or how well trained you are, the scammers are trained in their job of getting money. And I've always said that if they could do for good what they do for bad, they would be phenomenal. They would be.
They'd make great telemarketers for sure.
Absolutely. But in the meantime, you know, they've ripped everything out that I thought I was, you know, that well-trained, smart woman. I was like, how in the world did they get me? Until I realized that if they could get someone like me, they could get anybody.
That's right.
And that's the switch. And that's when I understood, and I've done a lot of work on myself, and I worked with a lot of organizations over the last 10 years to understand that it wasn't me. And when you understand that it wasn't your fault. And I really loved what you did a while back where we had our survivors in the support group write a letter to themselves explaining what happened, so that we could forgive ourselves of that thing.
Right.
That was really powerful for me, that we all goof, and this is a big goof financially, but it either can stop you or it can power you on into something greater. And it's understanding that we've got a greater purpose here than letting this consume us every day. The waste of energy, you can't change it right now, but you can help somebody else tomorrow. And that's the catalyst for me.
And victims blaming themselves is the reason why that 2/3, maybe 3/4 of victims never recover, because they lock themselves in their denial, where they refuse to recognize, yeah, okay, I was scammed, but I don't want to talk about it. They don't accept the reality of it actually happening.
We think we're better than that, you know, and I look back, as we were talking earlier about the infidelity. I mean, I went through that years and years ago in my marriage. And when that happened, the first person I blamed was me. Had nothing to do with me. And I'm thinking, what is wrong with you? You know, why are you thinking that what he did with someone else is your fault? Because then I was like, well, you were too busy. You were spending too much time with the kids. You. And I'm thinking, heck no, this wasn't me. So you gotta just shun the blame and move on and realize you can't change what happened in the past.
Well, moving on is a challenging thing.
It is.
It begins with accepting what really happened.
Yeah.
Not what you think happened, but what really happened. And then moving towards forgiving yourself.
And forgiving the other person's act.
But you got to forgive yourself first.
You're first, right? Yeah, because it's easier to forgive somebody else than it is to forgive yourself. I've found.
But you're really not forgiving somebody else if you haven't forgiven yourself, because you're just internalizing the blame in yourself.
Correct. Correct. So that's a whole nother story.
So one of the things that comes out of this concept of blaming is lasting trauma that's caused by this. And that's something that most people don't really understand, is that victim blaming is something that is not only caustic, but it's cancerous. It grows. And if you allow yourself to go down that path, then what ends up happening is you become one of those trolls. You become a chronic blamer of everybody in the world except yourself. Because you're not to blame for anything. You gotta accept responsibility, but not blame yourself. And unfortunately, victim blaming isn't a victimless act in and of itself, because what you're doing is you're increasing the trauma on the person who was victimized, because you're preventing them from finding their pathway, their recovery out of this nightmare. So it's important to understand that when you blame victims, you're denying them their ability to recover to a great extent.
Yeah.
The more blame occurs, the worse it will be. And I'm saying that specifically to families and friends. Police officers, okay, that's a one-time event. The victim goes in, they go out, okay, they can get over that easily enough, even though it may have very lasting impact. But the more pervasive, which is family and friends who cannot accept that this was something that happened to their friend or their family member and that they were not to blame, then that blaming goes on for a period of time. It derails the victim's ability to recover. It increases their trauma and increases the time it's going to take at some point in the future, if ever, to recover from that.
Well, it becomes, especially if the victim is an older person that perhaps has to now go live with the family members. And so it is inconveniencing the family members. And it turns out to be a very selfish thing to start blaming that person. But you can understand it that, okay, so mom, you have now changed my life because you're living in my home and I'm taking care of you and all those kinds of things. And I didn't plan on it. I planned on you taking care of me when you passed on with my inheritance. So it's very an interesting dynamic of how families feel if they are involved in it daily. In my case, they were not. And when I remarried, my husband sat with me and talked to the kids and said, you are not going to be affected by this other than your mom speaking out. But financially, you're not, which was very, I was very grateful for that. But the folks that are not as fortunate as I have been so far, that, shut themselves off from the world and are consumed by this themselves, their family sees that. And they don't know how, like Vianey said, they don't know how to help that person get out of it, because they may not have the finances to help them out. They may not have a home that they can bring them into, but there are things that we can do to support, and getting them into our support group is the thing to do.
Okay, so perfect segue into the final segment of this, which is victims themselves, as a part of their own blame, use language when they talk to other people, and this language matters tremendously. It's important for us to remember that the words that we use dramatically affect other people's perception in us. And for example, when we talk about being scammed or a scammer, these are minimization words. They hide the true impact that this was a crime. If you want to describe it, it's fraud, period. It wasn't a scam. Scam sounds like this little bug that crawls across the floor, right? When we use language like I was naive, I was fooled, I was gullible, Stop using those words because those are blaming words. They imply complicity. They imply stupidity. You weren't stupid. You were outclassed by expert criminals. You were not prepared. You were ignorant. No shame in being ignorant. There's no shame in not being prepared. You don't know what you don't know. That's okay. You're not to blame for that. But when you use these kinds of apologizing words or self-blaming, self-negation words, it makes it difficult because you're giving other people permission to blame you. And it took us a little while to figure that one out. But that's the truth, is the language each victim uses, and organizations like us and society. For example, catfish is a highly derogatory word. People don't bother to figure out, where did this word come from? What does it actually mean? Okay, Bitcoin. Bitcoin. Logical. It's a digital currency. Makes perfect sense. Completely neutral. Catfish. Where did it come from? It was a derogatory term that came from the early days of online dating. Men called women who mischaracterized themselves or used false photos catfish, implying cat, women, fish, hunt, catch, whatever you want to call it. So we have to stop using these blaming words and describe these crimes for what they are. And you know, and as a society, as a culture, we're really good at minimizing things. So we don't say anymore that a spouse beat their wife or their husband or whatever. And we know that domestic abuse happens with men and it happens with women. Mm-hmm. Johnny Depp, whether you agree or disagree, is an example of that. We don't say that the husband beat his wife anymore. It was domestic abuse. Now, abuse is a good word, but it's a minimizing word because it's not specific. It's violence is what it is. And fraud is an act of violence. We should use the right words 100% of the time. And we've all been guilty of this because we all use the common terminology, but in many cases, this terminology is wrong. And it's up to an organization like SCARS to pound our fists on the table and help people understand they're using the wrong words. And they're using words that give permission to others to blame them.
I think that's evolving as we go forward too. And as we have dedicated ourselves to changing the words that we use, we can change the words of others, because every interview we've done in the last couple of months where we've put a premium on that change of wording, yep, we have helped others understand that catfished and scam and all that are not appropriate. Right. And I think when they understand fraud, it doesn't sell magazines, it doesn't sell media stations, but it's understandable. And I think that is what's important, is we have to make this understandable to the masses so they get it.
Right. That's one of the reasons why when we relocated our corporation from Delaware to Florida for further transparency, we changed the name of our organization from Romance Scams to Relationship Scams, because these are a relationship based upon trust between the victim and a criminal. That's neutral. But when we use words like romance scam and love scam and sweetheart scam, we're implying that there was a love relationship that didn't exist. Victims had the emotional feelings, but they were manipulated into having them. The scammer was using grooming and manipulative techniques to get the victim to feel a certain way. We're all human and we're all subject to having our amygdalas hijacked, and as a result, every marketer in the world uses these techniques. Every politician uses language and imagery to get our amygdalas to juice us up with neurotransmitters and hormones for us to feel something. Every time we watch a movie, this happens. Scammers just do what the other guys do, but with a bit of a difference. But the important part is to remember that this is a violation, that it happened without the victim's consent. The only mistake they made was saying hello. After the conversation began, they began to lose control. So I think that we are nearing the point where, you know, we put up the commercials and, you know, we talk about the need for support. We've mentioned this throughout. Our organization is here to support scam victims, and we're findable on Facebook, online at romancescamsnow.com, as well as contraestafas.org. We're here to help victims to recover. We're not here to hate victims. We're not here to blame victims. We don't even hate the people who abuse victims, but we hope to educate them on the proper way to care for victims of online financial fraud or phone or text, whatever. Remember, it's incredibly important that we always report these crimes. If you are a friend or a family member of a scam victim, help them report these crimes. Be a wingman, be a buddy, go in with them, help them get these reported. Every report matters. The police may not chase after the criminals, but the reports help the government to extradite them in some cases. Reporting also restores the power and control for the victim. It helps them to accept that they are the victim of a crime and not to blame. Where to report? We have this published everywhere, but the basic idea is you report to the FTC, you report to anyscam.com. Oop, got a typo in there, but it'll get you there anyway. To ic3.gov. Remember that the federal government isn't going to investigate crimes of less than $100,000. Always use the right words. It's fraud and it's with a criminal. If you use the right words, it makes it much easier to talk to the police because they understand those words. Remember, most of these crimes use impersonation, so avoid stranger phone calls, emails, text. Don't friend strangers on social media. Remember, if you get a phone call from a government agency, unless it's a police officer following up on a report that you made, hang up and call back on the real phone number. Verify everything. Never respond to anyone's demands immediately, especially if they want a login or a password or anything of that nature. Always please ask family and friends for their opinions and report every scam. Be proud of the victim. Don't blame them. They discovered this and ended this crime. This is incredibly hard. Help them focus on getting the rest of the work done. SCARS publishes a series of books, one of which specifically designed for family and friends, but we also have books designed as a self-help guide for scam victims themselves, workbooks, etc., that are incredibly helpful. They're available. All of our books are available on our company bookstore, which is shop.againstscams.org. Go and take a look. 100% of the profit from every sale goes to help us support more scam victims worldwide. Remember, we hear you. I've been doing this for 31 years. We've helped more than 7 million scam victims, almost 8. Nearly 12,000 scam victims have gone through our SCARS Steps recovery program and through our support groups since SCARS was founded. Oops. So please help us. If you can make a small donation to SCARS, it helps us provide more free services to scam victims worldwide. You can donate at donate.againstscams.org or visit any of our websites. Don't trust anybody online. Don't even trust us. Verify who we are. You can visit our corporate website at againstscams.org and verify who SCARS is. SCARS is also a formal government partner with the Department of Homeland Security for crime victims assistance. We're registered with the Department of Justice Office of Victims of Crime in their annual registration of victims assistance organizations, and also we're a formal reporting partner of the Federal Trade Commission. Remember, no guilt, no blame. There'll be another webinar next week. Never let this happen again by not blaming victims and by helping and supporting them. Please remember, SCARS is not a mental health care provider and does not provide counseling or therapy services. The statements or publications of our team are not intended to provide medical, legal, financial advice. This is just a conversation between our members. Any information provided or discussed is not intended to replace competent professional medical, legal, or financial advice. Consult a medical, psychological, legal, or financial professional before taking any actions or responding to any suggestions from others, including educational information provided by SCARS. Well, let's turn this off. You know, I think it's important that we emphasize one central fact, that every victim has a certain kind of a support circle. And that support circle includes SCARS as a assistance and recovery provider, but it also includes proper trauma counseling and therapy. Every victim should at least see a trauma counselor to be evaluated, because you may not believe that you're traumatized. Odds are you are. If you're angry and you want to go out for vengeance and you want to get those scammers and chase that justice, that's trauma talking. If you don't want to talk about the scam anymore and you're in denial, that's trauma talking. And every victim goes through it. Some of them are realistic enough that they can recognize it in themselves and understand that they need help. Most victims are not able to recognize that. That's truly tragic. So any final thoughts, Vianey, on victim blaming? Or anything else you would like to add into our webinar today?
No, just thank you for letting me be here. It was very interesting, and I hope see the next week be here again.
Okay, I didn't let you be here. You freaking earned this. You are a survivor, and you've gone through the wars, and you earned your right to be here today. You are an expert. And we all are, because we put in the thousands and thousands and thousands of hours necessary for us to call ourselves experts. And we've got the certification to prove it. Vianey is certified in deception. You know, microexpressions and all of those little things that people can spot when someone is telling lies. God help me, because I have a deception expert on my board of directors. I can't get away with anything. But the truth is, we have an incredible board of directors at SCARS. We have many victims. We have someone who is an expert in gratitude, and make sure that what we do is infused with gratitude, both for the victims that we serve and for our fellow members, even though we get grouchy sometimes. Sorry, Chris. So Debbie, what would you like to say as our final closing?
I just want to say, give yourself a little bit of grace and a little bit of forgiveness, and know that there's light. There's light at the end of the tunnel, and you didn't get scammed overnight. So give yourself some time to recover, and do it with the support of a really good organization and really good people who've been there and understand it, and just realize that you're not alone, and we're here to get through it together, and it does get better with time.
But it doesn't happen overnight. And the truth is, even for the most attentive participant in our recovery program, this is a process of months. Mm-hmm. If you're not actively involved in your own recovery, this is a process of years. So be kind to yourself, because it's going to take time. The funniest thing that it's not funny, but that we hear with new victims is, I want this to be over. It's a bit like kids in the backseat saying, are we there yet? No. It is extraordinarily hard to recover from this experience. This is a profoundly traumatizing experience in your life. And it is compounded by past traumas and past experiences that significantly affect how you're going to recover from this. It affects your resiliency to it. But the most important single fact is you are the victim of an organized transnational criminal organization. There is no he, there is no she, there is only a they. Because almost every single scam, at least those that originate out of West Africa and Eastern Europe, is a group of scammers working each victim. But the other most important aspect is you are not to blame. Don't hold yourself guilty to something that was beyond your control. Right?
Right.
All right. Thank you, ladies, for...
Thanks, Dr. Tim. Thanks, Vianey.
So this has been a presentation of the Society of Citizens Against Relationship Scams, SCARS. To learn more about scams, scammers, and recovery, visit romancescamsnow.com, romancescamsnow.com, or en español, Vianey,
Contraestafas.org.
otra vez.
Contraestafas.org.
Okay. And we thank Debby, who is an author of The Woman Behind the Smile. We urge every scam victim to buy this book on Amazon and read it. And also our own bookstore.
Or listen to it on Audible, because we did do podcasts in between the chapters on what is new, and I found that as a very valuable tool to listen to it on Audible.
Excellent. So, and as far as your family and your friends, make sure that they listen to our webinar on Dear Family and Friends. If you want, buy our slate book and just hand it to them. Tell them to read it if you don't want to go into a discussion. Or we also have the relevant parts of it available as articles in our section for families and friends on romancescamsnow.com. Thank you, everyone, for listening to us today. This webinar is copyright 2022 SCARS. Thank you all. Bye, everyone.